Good morning. Good to be here with you. If you would, go ahead and open up to Luke chapter 16. Luke 16 is where we're going to be spending our time this morning. Luke 16. We're going to be looking at the first several verses there at the parable of the unjust steward. And this is actually in our series of Jesus versus the Pharisees. So we're going to be talking about it from that perspective, and we'll get into that in just a second. Let me start out with one of the principles from the parable that will be taught, which is that if you can handle a little bit, you will be given more. And I'll illustrate that by saying that another child that Olivia is keeping right now is an 18-month-old, and he is, like any good 18-month-old, hungry most all the time. And he was given a bag of Lay's chips, the little kind you buy at a concession stand. And so he eats that bag, and then when he's done with that bag, what does he want? He wants another bag. And he eats the entire second bag. Why? Because if you can handle a little bit, you'll be given even more. And we do that with children, but God does that with us too. And we're going to see that at play just a little bit in this parable that we're going to look at. But let's start into this parable by actually backing up to chapter 15 for a little bit of context. Chapter 15, verse 1. It says, "Then all the tax collectors and sinners drew near to him," that is Jesus, "to hear him. And the Pharisees and scribes complained, saying, 'This man receives sinners and eats with them.' And so he spoke this parable to them." What parable? Well, he actually spoke three parables in a row. The first one is the one of the lost sheep. We covered that a few weeks ago. Second is that of the lost coin. And the third is that of the prodigal son, or the lost son. And that one's probably the most famous of the three because we're probably a lot more able to draw some parallels to ourselves in that story. But in all three of these cases, Jesus is trying to make the same point, which is if you're going to be real religious leaders of these people, then you can't look at them as just sinners. You have to be willing to teach them and to help them. And they still don't really get the message. And so Jesus is going to go on in chapter 16 to explain even more what he means about the Pharisees, but he's still going to use a parable. But in chapter 16 now, in verse 1, we'll see that it is to his disciples that he speaks these things. So Jesus speaks a lot of different parables, and he speaks them to a lot of different audiences. And in this case, he is targeting a specific audience, which is his own disciples. Why? Because they need to know a whole lot if they're going to be able to replace Jesus after he's gone. If they're going to be able to continue the mission of Jesus, they need to know the things that Jesus is able to teach them. And so, he's going to teach this to his disciples, but there are others that are there to hear it as well, but they're going to get just a little bit of extra help in this way. But this entire parable is to explain why the Pharisees are doing something wrong. And I don't know any hard numbers on it, but it's probably about a third of parables that are directed at the Pharisees, trying to make the point of something that the Pharisees are doing wrong. And so we see that over and over again. And we'll see that again because these Pharisees are unmoved by the previous three parables, and now he's going to try to teach them and his disciples specifically a little bit more. But with the parable right before this in chapter 15, as in the parable of the prodigal son, who is it that the prodigal son represents? Well, that would be someone that is a lost sinner. But who's the other son? See, whenever we come to parables, and we'll talk about this with this parable, the question is not what happens in the parable. If there's anything you can learn this morning about parables, it should be this. When you read a parable, it's not about what's happening in the parable, it's about who is meant in the parable. So if we read a parable, we could say, oh, that's about a pearl. That's nice. Or, oh, that's about a net. Well, that seems nice. Or it's about a fig tree. It's about whatever the topic of the parable is. Doesn't really matter. What matters is who it's about. And in the case of the prodigal son, it's about the Pharisees. Not the prodigal son, but the one that when the prodigal returns home says, well, he should never have left. Why are you so happy that he's back? That's the Pharisees. The Pharisees are wondering why God would ever accept a sinner back into his fold. The Pharisees don't even want it to happen. And that's what we're going to see in this parable too. So again, when we look at this parable in chapter 16, who is who? When we look in verse 1, it says, there was a certain rich man who had a steward. Those are two of the three characters in the parable. Who are they? Well, the rich man, the rich master of the household, will be God. We'll just go ahead and say this from the beginning, so it'll hopefully help us as we go through. But it'll be God. Or you could say it's Christ, but it's God in one form or another. Probably God the Father. And then the steward of the household, who we'll talk more about, of course, the steward would be the Pharisees. Now, sometimes when you read a parable, you can know who the parable is about by who Jesus is speaking to. Not in this case, he's speaking to his disciples, but it's not about his disciples. And if I go into this parable thinking, oh, well, maybe the steward those are the disciples of Christ. Maybe the master is the high priest. Well, I'm going to get everything wrong. So we have to identify who is who when we start into this parable. The rich man is God. The steward is representative of the Pharisees as a whole. And then the third people that we'll run into a little bit later are those who owe, or those who are debtors to the master. And I'll go ahead and suggest that those are the common people, just everybody else, which would include Jesus' own disciples. It would include people that aren't his disciples, just the rest of the Jews as a whole. So those are our three characters, and once we know them and we look through the parable, things should start to make a little bit of sense. So what's happening in the parable? Still verse 1, certain rich man who had a steward, and an accusation was brought to him that this man was wasting his goods. What is a steward? Well, we don't really use those today, not in the same way that they did back then. And even if we did use them today, most of us wouldn't know anything about it because they're pretty much for rich people. And usually what would happen is somebody would leave for a while, or they would just have other business to attend to. And so they would put someone in charge of all their stuff. And this person was called a steward. They were a manager of the estate. And they would essentially make decisions on behalf of the owner or the master of the estate. And if they did well, they were paid for it, and they would be paid for it. And if they did poorly, they could be removed. Well, what's happening here? This steward, who is supposed to be managing the goods of this owner, instead is wasting the goods at the end of verse 1. So verse 2 says, so he called him and said to him, what is this I hear about you? It's funny how news gets out pretty quickly. Give an account of your stewardship, for you can no longer be steward. So he's being removed. Why? Because an accusation has been brought up that he did something wrong. And you can tell that he did something wrong because he starts to try to make other plans. He realizes that he's ruined. If you have to give an account of all the things that you've done, if you've done well, are you scared? No. If you've done poorly, you're terrified. And that's what happens with this steward. He knows that he has done very poorly with his master's goods. Verse 3. The steward says, what shall I do? For my master is taking the stewardship away from me. I cannot dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I love that line. And this will sound, I don't know what it'll sound like, but I think it's funny because to me it reminds me of certain classes of people. People that maybe grew up as trust fund babies, we call them, or maybe someone that is a career politician. And you think, okay, well, if you lose your job or if you lose your trust fund, what happens? Oh, I don't know how to work, and I'm ashamed to beg. So what am I going to do? And that's what this man is, that's his position. He's saying, I can't provide for myself. I don't know how to work a real job, and I'm too ashamed to beg. I'm too prideful, really, to beg. So what will I do? So he has a plan. Great plan, sort of. The plan happens in verses 4 through 7. And we'll just explain it to say that his plan is to take his master's debtors. So not people that owe him money, but people that owe his master money. And he will go to them and he'll say, okay, you owe me, or you owe my master X amount, cut that in half. Why? So that when I am kicked out of this stewardship, that I'll have some nice person or someone that at least should be a friend to me because I did something nice for them. So what is his plan? To mooch on other people once he gets kicked out of his job. Great plan. But that's the plan that he has, and he does this in the last day, I guess, of him being a steward. And he does this at least a few times so that he'll have somewhere to live. At least that's the idea. Of course, the problem is the master knows about this too. And so the master's going to come to him and also look for an explanation for this. But it's interesting because we get to verse 8 and it says the master condemned? No. The master commended the unjust steward because he had dealt shrewdly. Why would the master commend, why would he compliment, sort of, the unjust steward for what he had done? And I think we can get it a little bit mixed up if we take it too seriously. I know that sounds strange, but the master comes to him saying, "Oh, good job," but not in an actual way to say, "Oh, well, you've done a great job and I should reward you for this." No, instead you still will lose the stewardship and you'll still be punished, maybe even more so because you've made me less money because these people owed me so much and you said they could pay me less. But he says, in earthly terms, okay, that was clever. That was a good idea, even if it was still unjust. And to be clear, like we said, God is the manager. So we don't want to attribute the manager as God saying, "Oh, well, somebody did something that was kind of conniving and that was good." No, it wasn't good, but it's God saying, "Okay, well, you've done something that was shrewd, or you've done something that was smart in the terms of the world at least." But again, God will still demand an answer for this as well. And there will be punishment even for the forgiving of these debts that he's done. And then after this, of course, we have application. But what's always nice is when Jesus stops telling the parable and when he decides that he's going to go ahead and make application. You'll notice that happens whenever he's speaking to his disciples. It doesn't usually happen when he's preaching to a large crowd or to the Pharisees. He'll just tell the story. But when he's speaking to his disciples, sometimes he'll give the explanation. So what is Jesus' own explanation of this parable? And then we'll hit a few other things about the parable as well. But starting in verse 9. In verse 9, Jesus' first application from what he's just said is, "And I say to you, make friends for yourselves by unrighteous manner, that when you fail, they may receive you into an everlasting home." I will admit that verse sounds strange when you first read it, but I think we can make some sense of it. First, let's address the word mammon, because that's not what we usually say. It is an Aramaic word. It has been transliterated. Nobody bothered to translate it. They just took it from the original language and put it in here. And it's used again in verse 13, but the word mammon just means wealth, or it can mean riches, but it means wealth. So the statement is, go ahead and make friends for yourselves by unrighteous wealth. Okay, it's kind of a strange thing for God to say to people, or for Christ to say to people. And yet, it makes sense only once we get to the last phrase in the verse, which is that they may receive you into an everlasting home. So what kinds of friends is Jesus telling his disciples to make? Is he saying use your money to make friends on earth? Nope. He says use your money to make everlasting friends. You can take that two ways. Either that means you do good with your money so that Christ and God are friends to you. Makes enough sense. Or it means you use your money to do good so that others are blessed by you, and in turn, when you get to heaven, and if they're there as well, then you will have everlasting friends in that everlasting home. Either way could be true. Either way probably is true. So make friends for yourselves, not just on this earth, but make everlasting friends. Make a bargain with someone, not just so you can stay in their home for a while after you get kicked out of your stewardship, like in the parable, but instead make eternal friends that will reward you with an eternal home. That's the first application. Second thing, verse 10 says, "He who is faithful in what is least is faithful also in much, and he who is unjust in what is least is unjust also in much." Let's put that in simpler terms. Faithfulness is universal within your life. Faithfulness is universal. What does that mean? It means that if you are faithful in one area, then you'll be faithful in every area. If you're responsible and faithful with your money, you'll probably be responsible with your family, with your work, with the church. But if you're unresponsible, if you're unfaithful with money, you probably won't be responsible in those areas either. Let's use a couple illustrations to maybe make that clear. How many people that have a gambling addiction, like we talked about in class this morning, how many of those people are great parents? Probably not many. Most of the time when you have a gambling addiction, that unfaithfulness with money carries over into any other area of life. Or how many people that are in the midst of affairs are just wonderful, phenomenal employees? Probably not many. Why? Because faithfulness goes across every area of life. That's what Jesus says here. If you're unfaithful with just a little bit, you'll be unfaithful with everything else. We also saw that, just to bring up class again, in Judas this morning. We said Judas was unfaithful with the money bag that the disciples, the apostles, carried with them, that he would steal from it. What happened later? Judas was unfaithful to the point of taking 30 pieces of silver to betray his Savior. So unfaithfulness is not just local. It's not just local in one area of life, but instead it spreads throughout your entire life. Verse 12. Verse 12, and if you have not been faithful in what is another man's, who will give you what is your own? People will be given what they are able to handle. And sometimes that's not the case. We didn't exactly look at it this morning, but this is tied in with gambling as well. Sometimes you will find someone that has played the lottery and has won in spite of always mishandling their finances, part of which was playing the lottery so often in the first place. But when we look at this idea that if you're responsible, you'll be given more to be responsible for, well, that wasn't true in their case. But what usually happens? What happens almost every time that someone who is very poor at managing their money wins the lottery, well, they end up as bad off, if not worse off, than they started within a year of winning. So faithfulness, again, will carry over into every area of life. If you're responsible, you'll gain more responsibility. And if you're not, you won't. You see that in the workplace. If you're responsible, you'll probably be promoted to something with more responsibility. Even in the church, that would be true. If you're responsible, if you're able to do things, then you'll be asked to do more. And it should be that way. Verse 13. No one or no servant can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. Who are the two masters? It says you cannot serve God and wealth. You can't serve both. What does that mean? Well, what's your priority? What's your primary motivation in life? If your motivation is wealth, it'll show that. Your life will show that. If your motivation is God, then that'll show as well. But you can't have both. You can't be driven by both. It has to be one or the other. Now, of course, you can make money and be faithful to God, but you can't be, your primary motivator in life cannot be wealth, and you still be faithful to God. It will not work out. What else do we learn? That's Jesus' application of his own parable. I don't pretend that I can apply things as well as Jesus can, but there are a couple more things we can say. Number one, let's fully explain the meaning of the parable. And I don't think I've ever understood this before, and a lot of it is because I've never taken the time to ask, well, who is who within this parable? So we said God is the master, the steward represents the Pharisees, and then the debtors are the common people. God went away for a while, and he left the care of something in the hands of the religious leaders known as the Pharisees. Actually, they kind of took it upon themselves. But still, they were responsible for what God had left. What did God leave? God left his word in their hands. Were they faithful with his word? Well, if they were faithful with his word, then they would faithfully teach it to others, right? That didn't happen. Instead, what happened? Whenever we go back in verses 6 and 7, we see if the master said, you owe 100 measures of oil, you should write down that you only owe him 50. What did the Pharisees do with the law? Whatever they wanted. If the law said do this, the Pharisees said, oh, you don't really have to do that. Instead, do this. And if the law says that you need to do this thing, well, you can do part of that thing, but you don't have to do the whole. Why did they do that? To make people like them, to make earthly friends, to gain power, to gain fame. So right in the middle of this parable is a direct insult of sorts to the Pharisees, but it's just calling them out on what's true. That they're taking God's law, which God made them stewards of, that they need to be responsible with, and instead they're chopping it up into whatever it needs to look like so it'll make them more popular and make them more money. Unjust steward. Makes a lot of sense. The Pharisees are, in fact, the unjust steward. Like we said, the debtors are the common people. The common people that are relying on that steward to tell them the truth and tell them what the master requires of them. The Pharisees do not accurately relate that to them. Instead, they cut it in half, as it were. So the whole purpose of the parable is to say that the stewards of God's word should be faithful with it, but they were not. Instead, they desired money, they desired fame, and the common people suffered as a result. But the other point is that God will require an account of their stewardship. That's pretty scary to hear if you're a Pharisee. Although they thought that they were doing everything right anyway, but they weren't. So God will demand an account. Second question here is, how are we using what we have been given? Stewardship. We are stewards of what God has given. What has God given us? Well, we say this sometimes when somebody has a terminal disease, but it's true all the time. You're living on borrowed time. Who is it borrowed from? God. You're using borrowed money. Where's it borrowed from? God. Well, we also have God's word that we borrowed from him. That is his. How are we using those three things? How do we use what God has given us? When God demands an account, which he will, when this life ends for us individually or when Christ returns, when God demands an account and he says, how have you spent my time and my money, and how have you used my word? What will the answer be? Will we be found an unjust steward, or will we have been not only just, but a good steward of what God has given? The third thing tied directly to this, from verse 2, when it says, what is this I hear about you? And then says, give an account of your stewardship. Word gets out. Somehow it always does. And in this life, people might never know. If you can cover up well enough that you mismanage your money, if you can mismanage your time but still do just well enough to fly under the radar, or even if you take God's word and say, well, I'll use it for myself, but I won't spread it to others, you can get away with that in this life. But there will come a day when God will demand an account. And the news will be out then of how we have, what actions we've taken, what inaction we're guilty of as well. This morning, I hope you understand the parable of the unjust steward a little bit better. I hope you understand how it applies to the Pharisees, but I also hope you understand how it applies to you and to me. This morning, if you are able to handle what you have been given so far, and you're looking to have more added to that, in terms of the church, this would be a great opportunity for you to say, yeah, I'd like a little more responsibility. It's not always going to be the case that somebody asks you to do something. Sometimes you step up yourself and say, this is what I think needs to be done. And of course, the church can decide that, the others can decide that, but are you willing to do more? If so, great. Make that known. Today, if you are guilty of any action, any wrong stewardship of what God has given you, this is the time to change that, to live a better life, to handle things better. And today, if you are guilty of inaction, if you're guilty of doing nothing with what God has given you, this is the time to change that as well. God has given you his grace that can save, and God has given you his word that can be shared with others to save them. And this morning, if you've not done that, and you need to start doing that, this is the time. If there's any other need that you have in the church, come forward now as we stand, as we sing.